Alex had never felt so helpless. The rain began to fall heavily, the water rising around him quickly, filling the pit. He panicked, his breath shallow, as the cold, muddy water began to reach his chest. Every part of him screamed for escape, but there was no way out. He was trapped, helpless. His mind raced, thoughts spinning in a frantic loop, but nothing came to him. The anger that had always been his shield, his way of protecting himself, now felt useless. Couldn't save him. Suddenly, his eyes caught something that made his heart freeze. The puppy, the little dog who had tried so hard to help him, was nowhere to be seen. It had disappeared. He hadn't noticed it leave. Chapter 1. The Boy with the Slingshot. Alex was different. He wasn't like the other kids in the neighborhood. He didn't laugh when they laughed or cry when they cried. He didn't care for games or sports, and he most certainly didn't care about anyone. He was an observer, a silent one, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next moment of twisted amusement. His hands, calloused and strong for his age, gripped the slingshot like it was a part of him. His face hard and expressionless as he aimed at anything that moved. The pigeons fluttered through the air, unaware of their impending fate. With a sharp snap of his wrist, the stone flew through the air, striking one with sickening precision. The bird plummeted to the ground, its life snuffed out in an instant. Alex stared at the still body, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He wasn't like the other kids. They never understood why he did it, but he didn't need them to. The truth was, for Alex, cruelty wasn't just something he did for fun. It was a way to survive. "Stop!" A voice echoed behind him. It was Jamie, the kid from the house down the street, always getting in trouble for being too loud, too talkative, too everything. Alex didn't turn around. "Why?" he asked flatly, his eyes still on the dead bird. "Because it's wrong. It's just wrong," Jamie protested, crossing his arms. Alex could hear the tremor in his voice, the faint sense of fear beneath his words. It was the same every time. "Who says?" Alex sneered. "Who says what I do is wrong? You? You don't even know what real pain feels like." Jamie hesitated, as if considering whether to challenge him. "I do. I know what it feels like to be ignored, to be treated like you don't exist. Maybe that's why I don't hurt things." Alex's grip tightened around the slingshot. There it was, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He hated it when people tried to make him feel something. He hated when they tried to make him feel like he wasn't justified. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, turning his back on Jamie and walking away. As he walked home, the familiar landscape of his neighborhood felt cold and unforgiving. The cracked sidewalks, the rusted fences, the peeling paint on the houses. It all reminded him of the home he never truly had. He didn't expect anyone to understand him, and that was how he liked it. He didn't want to be understood. Not now, not ever. But even as he walked through the door, past his mother's vacant stare and his father's harsh words, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something inside him was broken, and no matter how many slingshots or dead birds he collected, it didn't fill the hole. That night, he sat alone in his room, the sound of shouting coming from downstairs. His parents were fighting again. His father's voice was loud and angry, while his mother's words were quieter, more pleading. But Alex didn't care. He didn't want to hear them. He couldn't stand the noise. Instead, his eyes were drawn to the small window in his room. The moonlight cast long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, everything felt still, calm. But the peace never lasted. The sound of something scratching at the door startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He got up, annoyed, and opened it, expecting to find a stray cat or maybe a rat. But instead, there was nothing, just darkness. He stood there, staring out into the night, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. A feeling, an instinct, told him that something was about to change. Little did he know, that night would mark the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand. The slingshot in his pocket felt heavier, as though it too knew that something was coming. Something that would make him question everything he thought he knew. As he closed the door and returned to his room, He noticed a small shadow move at the corner of his window. Something small, something alive. A dog. A skinny, scruffy little creature, looking at him with large, soulful eyes. It was strange how, in that moment, Alex felt a flicker of curiosity, but he quickly brushed it off. "It's just a dog," he muttered to himself. "Just a stupid stray." Still, as he lay down on his bed that night, the image of the dog lingered. That was the moment when everything started to shift. That was the moment when Alex's world would crack open, and a slingshot that had once been a symbol of his power would become a symbol of his downfall. The next morning, Alex woke up to an empty house. His mother was gone, his father absent as usual. But the strange feeling from last night hadn't faded. It had only grown stronger. And then, out of nowhere, he heard a soft whimper outside his window. The dog. He couldn't help himself. Curiosity gnawed at him as he crept toward the window, pulling back the curtain ever so slightly. And there it was, standing on the ground below, looking up at him with those same soulful eyes. Seemed like the dog was waiting for something, maybe for Alex to notice it. But why? And in that moment, Alex felt something shift inside of him. He couldn't explain it, but something about that dog was different. Something was coming. Something unexpected. Something that would change everything. As Alex stared out at the dog, he couldn't help but wonder. Could this be the thing he had been waiting for all his life? Before he could answer his own question, the dog barked once, as if in response, and turned, disappearing into the bushes at the edge of his yard. Alex stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to make of it. Chapter 2. The House Where Love Doesn't Grow. Alex's house wasn't a home. It hadn't been for years. The air inside was thick with tension, a constant hum of unspoken words and suppressed anger. Every day was a battle between his mother and father, a clash of voices, the shattering of glass, the slamming of doors. Nothing ever changed. Nothing ever improved. His mother was never happy. She rarely spoke to him unless it was to tell him to go to his room or stop causing trouble. Her face was pale, hollowed by the weight of her own disappointments. She barely looked at him these days, her eyes distant, her expression vacant. There were days when Alex wondered if she even remembered that she had a son. His father, on the other hand, was always angry. Angry at the world, angry at life, and most often angry at Alex. It was as if his father's rage was the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. When Alex was younger, he had tried to understand it, tried to make sense of the arguments, but now he didn't even bother. He had stopped caring. The shouting didn't faze him anymore. It was just another background noise to his existence. This morning was no different. Alex woke to the sound of his father yelling downstairs. His voice carried through the thin walls of their small house, harsh and unrelenting. "You never listen. You never understand anything. It's all your fault." His father's voice cracked with frustration. Alex didn't move. He lay still in his bed, eyes staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable sound of his mother's soft sobs to follow. It was always the same. His father would shout, his mother would cry, and Alex would retreat further into himself, like he had done so many times before. The whole world felt like a fog, suffocating him, clouding his thoughts, his actions, his future. The door to his room opened without warning, and his father stepped in, his face red, eyes blazing. "What's this?" His father's voice was low, but it still carried the weight of anger. "Another day of doing nothing, huh? Another day of lying around while the world falls apart around you." Alex didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to argue. What was the point? His father would only find something else to scream about. He stared at the wall, his fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket, trying to shut it all out. "Get up!" His father's hand grabbed his arm, yanking him out of bed. "You think you can just sit here while everything crumbles? You think you're better than us?" Alex flinched but said nothing. His father's grip tightened as he shook him, but still, Alex didn't respond. There was no point in trying to defend himself. His father never listened. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. His father stared at him, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. But Alex didn't give him one. He had learned long ago that silence was the safest option. His father released his arm with a disgusted sigh and turned on his heel, walking out of the room, leaving Alex to his thoughts. The door slammed behind him. The house was silent again. Alex sat up in bed, feeling the weight of his father's anger still lingering in the air. His fingers curled into fists as he looked around the room, the familiar, oppressive walls closing in on him. The place was suffocating. The house, the noise, the fighting. It was all too much. He stood up, his feet hitting the cold floor with a dull thud. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in on him. He needed to get out. He needed to breathe. He grabbed his slingshot from the bedside table and slipped it into his pocket, feeling the familiar weight of it there. The world outside, at least, was his to control, his to conquer. He didn't need anyone. He didn't need anyone's love. Not after everything he had been through. Not after the years of cold indifference and hurtful words. Alex didn't know how long he had been walking, but by the time he reached the edge of the neighborhood, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and rain, the promise of a storm hanging in the air. His thoughts were a blur, his emotions like a storm inside him, swirling and crashing against one another. He didn't care about his parents. He didn't care about Jamie or the dog or anything else. All that mattered was that he didn't have to go home. He didn't have to face the chaos that waited for him there. But just as he rounded the corner, something caught his eye. The small dog from the night before. It was standing in the middle of the street, its tail wagging gently, its eyes fixed on him. It was a scrappy little thing, its fur matted and dirty, but there was something in the way it looked at him. Something that made Alex stop in his tracks. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade away. The shouting, the emptiness, the weight of his father's words. There was only the dog, standing there, looking at him with those bright, curious eyes. Alex hesitated. He wasn't used to this feeling. He wasn't used to being noticed, to being wanted. But there it was, this small creature waiting for him to notice it. His hand moved instinctively toward his slingshot, but before he could pull it out, the dog darted forward, its small form running toward him, its tail wagging even faster. Alex took a step back, confused. Why was it here? Why was it so eager to be near him? The dog stopped just in front of him, its eyes bright and pleading. It whined softly, as if asking for something. Alex stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. What was this? What was this strange feeling that was beginning to rise within him? For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. But before he could think further, the sound of a car engine rumbled down the street. The dog immediately bolted, darting away into the alley, disappearing into the shadows. Alex stood there, his hand still hovering over his pocket, the feeling of longing lingering in the air like a whisper. And then, as the car passed, the silence returned. But something had shifted in him, something small, but undeniable. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something different. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. And just as Alex turned to walk back home, he felt the weight of his slingshot in his pocket once more. But now, it didn't feel like something that could save him. Instead, it felt like something he might need to leave behind. And so, for the first time in a long while, he walked back with a sense of uncertainty, but also with a spark of something else, hope. Chapter 3, The Abandoned Path. The next morning, Alex couldn't shake the image of the dog from his mind. It had been a fleeting moment, a brief encounter in the shadow of his usual misery, but it had stirred something in him. That dog, it wasn't like the others. It hadn't looked at him with fear or disgust like the people in his life often did. No, the dog had seen him, really seen him, and in that moment, Alex had felt like he wasn't just a boy lost in the noise of the world. He had felt alive. But today, he couldn't afford to dwell on it. His father had already left for work, likely to spend the day in a haze of anger and bitterness, escaping the suffocating weight of home. His mother, silent as always, was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The house was just as cold as it had been the night before. Alex knew that, sooner or later, he would have to leave again. The idea of being trapped here with them, with all the noise and ugliness of the place, was suffocating. It was too much for him to bear. The world beyond the narrow streets of his neighborhood was his only escape. By noon, he found himself walking aimlessly through the woods at the edge of town. The trees loomed above him, their branches swaying in the wind. The forest was quieter than the streets, and for a while, Alex felt a strange sense of peace. He liked the way the silence wrapped around him, the way the wind carried whispers of something far away, something untouched by the chaos of his life. He wandered deeper into the woods, his slingshot still tucked into his pocket. The thought of using it had crossed his mind more than once, but today something held him back. The stones, the birds, the destruction. It all felt pointless now, like a game he had outgrown without even realizing it. As he walked, he noticed a narrow path winding through the trees, one he hadn't seen before. It was overgrown with weeds, the edges fraying like an abandoned dream. But there was something about it, something in the way it beckoned him forward. Without thinking, he stepped onto the path, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The further he went, the more the world around him seemed to close in. The trees grew thicker, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands, blocking out the sun and casting long shadows on the ground. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Alex's steps slowed as he reached the edge of the path. Ahead of him, the ground seemed to dip sharply, a drop so sudden it took him by surprise. He peered down, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A hole. A deep hole. A jagged crater in the earth, like the scar of something long forgotten. The walls of the pit were steep, the edges crumbling away with time, but the darkness inside. It was impossible to see the bottom. Curiosity tugged at him. He had always been drawn to the things that others ignored, the things that were broken and abandoned. He stepped closer, looking for some way down, some way to explore the strange, hidden place. But as he got too close to the edge, the ground beneath him gave way. Alex's heart leapt into his throat as he slipped, his arms flailing desperately. He tried to grab onto anything, but the ground was loose, and before he could stop himself, he fell. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of him as he tumbled into the pit. His body slammed against the jagged rocks at the bottom, pain shooting through his limbs. He gasped for air, disoriented, his head spinning. The world around him was nothing but shadows and crumbling walls. The ground was uneven, and his knees scraped against the jagged stones. His breath came in ragged gasps as he slowly pushed himself to his feet, the weight of the fall crashing down on him. "Great," Alex muttered to himself, the anger already rising inside him. Of course, he'd find some way to mess things up. He had been reckless, as always, and now he was trapped with no way out. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. His eyes scanned the walls of the pit, searching for something to grab onto, something to pull himself up with. But the walls were steep, slick with moss and dirt, and there was no way to climb out. "Help!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the emptiness. Someone, anyone, but the words hung in the air, unanswered, swallowed by the thick silence. No one would come. No one ever came when he needed them. For the first time, the realization hit him hard. He was completely alone. He sank to the ground, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. His mind raced, but all the solutions seemed impossible. There was no way out, no way to escape this place. And the darkness, the silence, pressed in closer, suffocating him. As the minutes dragged on, the panic began to grow. He could feel his pulse quickening, his breath becoming shallow. He hated this feeling, this helplessness, this vulnerability. He had always been the one in control, the one who made others feel small, the one who had the power. But now he was nothing, just a boy, trapped in a hole, with no one to help him, no one to save him. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a soft rustling, like something small moving through the underbrush. Alex froze, his heart racing. He hadn't imagined it. Someone was there. Someone had to be. He peered up at the edge of the pit, hoping to see someone looking down at him, someone who could pull him out. But no one was there. Then something appeared at the edge of the pit. A small, furry shape, stepping cautiously towards him. The dog. It stood at the edge, looking down at him with those bright eyes, tail wagging gently. It was the same dog from before, the scruffy little creature, its fur matted and dirty, but its eyes full of something Alex couldn't quite name. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The dog didn't run away. It didn't bark or turn its back. It simply watched him, waiting. Alex felt a strange knot in his chest. Could the dog help him? Could it actually pull him out of this mess? The dog sat down, staring at him, as if to say, "You're not alone. Not anymore." Alex's heart thudded in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something he hadn't even realized he needed. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, someone was offering him a way out. Chapter 4. The Unexpected Guest. Alex's pulse raced as he stared up at the scruffy dog standing at the edge of the pit. It wasn't what he had expected. He had thought for sure that no one would come. The dog wasn't much to look at. Its fur was tangled, covered in dirt and bits of leaves, and its ribs showed through its matted coat. But there was something in its eyes. A curious, unwavering gaze that seemed to peer right into Alex, as though it understood something he couldn't put into words. It was a moment of surreal clarity. He wasn't sure what it was. The desperation in his chest or the strange, quiet hope that the dog might somehow help him. But for a brief second, he felt the sharp sting of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. The dog shifted on its paws, moving closer to the edge of the pit, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Alex instinctively reached out, though he knew it was useless. He was too far below, too far away. But still, the dog's presence, its unwavering attention, held him in place. For a few minutes, the two of them simply looked at each other, separated by a vast, uncrossable gap. The world outside the pit seemed so distant now, so unreachable. All Alex could see was the dog's bright eyes, full of a strange kind of knowing, and the oppressive darkness of the pit around him. Then, the dog did something unexpected. It turned its head, looking back into the woods as if it was deciding something. Alex squinted, wondering what it was doing. When he heard the faintest rustle in the underbrush, his heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. Was it another dog? Person? The rustling grew louder, and before Alex could process what was happening, a figure emerged from the trees. It wasn't a dog. It was a woman. She appeared in the clearing above the pit, stepping lightly through the brush, her figure framed by the trees. She was dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, with a loose scarf wrapped around her neck, her dark hair tucked beneath a beanie. She was looking down at the pit with concern, her eyes wide as she assessed the situation. Alex's breath hitched. Could this be real? Was someone actually here to help him? The dog, seemingly satisfied with the woman's presence, trotted over to her and sat at her feet, wagging its tail. The woman bent down, giving the dog a quick pat before standing up straight again and finally looking down at Alex. "Hey there," she called gently. "Are you okay?" Alex could only stare, disoriented. His voice was trapped in his throat. His mind was still processing the bizarre turn of events. Who was she? Why was she here? I'm stuck, Alex finally managed, his voice shaking. I fell. I didn't mean to. The woman knelt down beside the pit, her face softening with concern. "I can see that. Hang tight, all right? I'll figure something out." She surveyed the pit, her eyes flicking over the rocks and the dirt. Alex could barely believe it. Was she really going to help him? For the first time in ages, the reality of someone he didn't even know, coming to his aid was overwhelming. The woman looked back at him, a reassuring smile on her face. "Don't worry, I won't leave you here." Before Alex could respond, she turned and began scanning the ground around the pit, looking for anything that might help. Her hands quickly worked through the underbrush, collecting branches and long vines, carefully arranging them into a makeshift rope. Alex's heart thudded harder in his chest. He couldn't believe it. He was used to being alone, to having no one to rely on, but here was someone who was actually trying to help him. "All right," she said after a moment, looking back down at Alex. "I think this will hold. I'm gonna toss it down to you. Try to grab it and pull yourself up. Okay?" Alex nodded, though the situation felt almost surreal. He was about to be pulled out of this pit, literally and figuratively, by a stranger. The woman lifted the rope high, tossing one end down toward Alex. He stretched out his hands, feeling the coarse texture of the vines as they settled in his grip. The rope was sturdy enough, and Alex could feel a flicker of hope ignite within him. "Can you pull yourself up?" the woman called down. "I'll try," Alex answered, his voice steady but still filled with uncertainty. He wasn't sure if he could actually do it. He wasn't sure if he even deserved to be saved. His fingers wrapped around the rope tightly, and with a deep breath, he began to pull. His arms burned as he struggled to lift himself up, his feet slipping on the uneven ground of the pit. But he didn't stop. The woman's voice was a constant reassurance from above, urging him on. "Almost there. Keep going." Alex's muscles screamed in protest, his body begging him to stop. But he kept going, hand over hand, until finally, his fingers brushed the edge of the pit. His head emerged first, followed by his chest, and with one final effort, he swung himself over the edge and collapsed onto the ground beside the woman. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the exhaustion crashing over him. But the fresh air, the wide open space, the sense of safety, it was almost overwhelming. He was out. He was free. The woman crouched beside him, her expression still kind but filled with concern. "You okay?" Alex could barely answer, still too winded to speak. He nodded, unable to find the words. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel angry or bitter or empty. He just felt grateful. It was an unfamiliar feeling, something he didn't know how to handle. The dog, seemingly satisfied with the rescue, barked happily and trotted in circles around them, wagging its tail furiously. Alex found himself smiling. It was a small, fleeting thing, a crack in the wall of all the anger and frustration he'd built up over the years, but it was real. The woman stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. "All right, I'm glad you're okay, but I've got to get going. You should head home too. Your parents must be worried." The thought of going back home made a heavy weight settle on his chest. But he knew she was right. He couldn't stay out here forever. "Thanks," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to repay you." She shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You don't have to. Just be safe, all right?" Before Alex could say anything more, the woman turned, the dog following at her heels. They disappeared into the trees, leaving Alex alone in the fading light of the day. He stood there for a moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Someone had helped him. Someone had cared enough to save him, to pull him out of the darkness. As he walked back toward the town, the echoes of the woman's kindness lingered in his mind. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him had shifted. Maybe it was the start of something new. Maybe this was the moment when he could finally start to change. For the first time in a long time, Alex didn't feel quite so alone. Chapter 5: Stones and Stubbornness. Alex couldn't stop thinking about the woman, the dog, and the strange, overwhelming kindness that had come from nowhere. It was as if a small, fragile crack had appeared in the wall he'd built around himself, and through it, a beam of something softer had slipped in. But as the days passed, that feeling began to fade, buried under the weight of his old habits, his old way of seeing the world. When he woke up the next morning, the warmth of the encounter felt like it belonged to someone else's life, not his. The anger, the bitterness, the apathy, those were the things that felt familiar. Those were the things he could count on. They were like armor, shielding him from the mess of emotions he couldn't understand. He found himself walking to the same spot where he had fallen into the pit. His heart was heavy, his mind restless. The thought of the woman and her dog lingered, but he pushed it aside. He didn't need help. He didn't need anyone. The woods felt different today. The trees towered above him, their gnarled branches twisting like they were reaching for something. The air was thick with tension, heavy and still. He could feel the weight of his anger creeping back in, like a storm building on the horizon. As he wandered deeper into the woods, he noticed a patch of dry earth, a familiar spot where he had sometimes used his slingshot to practice. He hadn't brought it with him today, but the thought of it stirred something in him. The desire to break something, to watch something fall apart, was still there, buried beneath the layers of confusion and uncertainty. He reached down, picking up a stone. It was small enough to fit in his hand, smooth and round, perfect for throwing. He could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline, the tension building in his chest as he wound up, ready to release it with all the force he could muster. And then, before he could throw it, something stopped him. A soft sound broke through the silence. A bark, a low and hesitant noise that made him freeze mid-motion. His eyes flicked to the side, searching for the source. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the dog. The same dog. It was standing there, watching him intently, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were waiting for him to do something. The dog's coat was still matted and dirty, but its eyes were the same, bright and unblinking, full of something Alex couldn't name. Alex stared at the dog, the stone still in his hand. For a moment, the air seemed to thicken, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. Everything about the situation felt wrong. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to keep everything buried, to let his anger take over like it always had. But something inside him shifted. A question hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Why was this dog here? Why was it looking at him like that? Slowly, cautiously, he dropped the stone to the ground, his fingers trembling as he let it slip from his hand. The dog didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just sat there, watching him. The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy. Alex felt his heart beat faster, his chest tight with uncertainty. The dog wasn't afraid. It wasn't running away. It wasn't even barking like it had before. It was just there, waiting. And then, as if it had made up its mind, the dog padded toward him, its steps slow but deliberate. It stopped just a few feet away from him, looking up at him with those same bright, knowing eyes. For the first time in a long time, Alex didn't feel the need to lash out. He didn't feel the impulse to hurt something, to strike at the world with his fists. He felt strange. The dog nudged his hand with its nose, as if asking for something. Attention, affection, anything. Alex hesitated. He had never been kind to animals before, never had a reason to be. They were just creatures to him, things to be ignored or worse, to be used as targets for his anger. But this dog was different. It wasn't asking for anything violent. It wasn't demanding anything from him. It was simply there, offering its presence, waiting for a response. He slowly extended his hand, cautiously at first, unsure of what to expect. The dog sniffed his fingers, then leaned forward, pressing its head against Alex's palm. It was warm, its fur soft despite the dirt that clung to it. Something inside Alex shifted again. A crack, this time bigger than before, one that let in the faintest breath of something like tenderness. He couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it, but for a moment he simply let the dog stay there, resting against him. The dog lifted its head and stepped back, as if satisfied, then trotted around Alex in circles, wagging its tail. Its joy was infectious, and despite himself, Alex couldn't help but smile. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it was there. A crack in the wall just a little wider. And then, before Alex could react, the dog turned and ran off into the woods, disappearing into the trees. Alex stood there for a moment, watching the spot where the dog had vanished, a strange emptiness settling in his chest. It was as if the dog had given him something, and now, just as suddenly, it was gone. He reached down to the ground and picked up the stone again, turning it over in his fingers. The impulse to throw it, to cause destruction, was still there. But now it felt different. He didn't want to destroy anymore. He didn't want to break things. He stood there, holding the stone for a long moment, before finally tossing it aside. It landed with a soft thud in the dirt. Forgotten. The dog had come and gone. But in that brief encounter, it had left something behind. Something Alex couldn't quite name, but something that lingered, like the faintest glimmer of light in the darkness. He stood there, in the quiet woods, for a long time, wondering what to do next. Chapter 6. The water rises. The weather had changed suddenly. What had begun as a clear, bright afternoon was quickly turning dark, clouds gathering in the sky like heavy wool, rolling in faster than Alex had expected. The cool breeze shifted, now carrying the promise of rain. He glanced up, frowning. He had been walking through the woods for a while now, lost in thought, trying to figure out what the dog's presence had meant, trying to make sense of the emotions it stirred in him. But now, it seemed the world itself was going to give him another reason to stop and pay attention. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and Alex felt the first raindrops splatter against his face. He sighed, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as the sky darkened further, turning a shade of charcoal gray. He glanced back toward the path leading home, but he didn't feel like going back yet. Not yet. He wasn't ready to face whatever waited for him at home. The storm, though, was another matter entirely. The trees above rustled as the wind picked up. Then, as if the sky itself had been waiting for the right moment, the rain came in full force, drenching everything around him in seconds. Alex's heart sped up at the sudden change in the weather. He cursed under his breath as he began to run toward the clearing, knowing it was probably a mistake to be caught in the woods during a storm like this. The last thing he needed was to be stuck out here, drenched and lost. As he made his way through the thickening underbrush, his thoughts flickered back to the pit. He hadn't been able to forget about it. The way he had fallen, the strange moment of vulnerability when the dog had come to him, when the woman had helped him out. His mind raced. What if she hadn't been there? What if the dog hadn't found him? The feeling of panic returned, that tightness in his chest. He reached the clearing, but the storm had worsened. The rain poured down so hard it felt like the world was being drowned. The sky flashed, lightning cutting through the air, the thunder shaking the ground beneath his feet. Alex turned, trying to gauge the direction of the path back home. But the woods had taken on a strange, unfamiliar shape in the storm. Suddenly, a sharp, searing pain shot through his ankle, and he stumbled, his feet giving way under him. He looked down and saw that he had stepped into the edge of the pit, the same one from days ago. Alex's stomach lurched as he realized the gravity of his situation. The pit was filled with rainwater, and it had already begun to fill up, the once dry earth now slick and dangerous. In a panic, he scrambled to pull himself away, but the mud around him was slippery, his hands sinking deeper into the muck with every movement. He could hear the water rushing around him, the ominous gurgling as it quickly rose higher. His heart raced, the storm's fury matching the rising tide of panic inside him. He could feel the cold, wet earth beneath him, and for a terrifying moment, he understood the depth of his own isolation. This was a different kind of pit. The world was spinning around him, the rain blurring his vision, and the water continued to rise. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the relentless storm, carried off in the wind like it had never existed. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. No one's coming. The thought wrapped around him like a vice. He wasn't going to be saved this time. There would be no mysterious woman, no loyal dog. He was alone, completely alone, and the weight of that truth crashed over him, cold and suffocating. This was how it always was, wasn't it? He had been alone long before he'd ever fallen into the pit. He'd learned not to rely on anyone, not to expect anyone to reach out for him. His thoughts turned frantic. He needed to get out, but the water was rising too quickly. He scrambled, desperate to find a foothold, but the mud was slick with rain, and the walls of the pit seemed to stretch up and out of reach. The water was now up to his knees, soaking through his shoes, making his feet feel numb. The rain didn't stop, only poured harder, turning everything into a blur of water and sound. Focus, focus. He gripped the edge of the pit, trying to pull himself up, but the walls were steep. Every movement felt like it took everything from him, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. His breath came in ragged gasps, panic bubbling up inside him. What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to get out of this? And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the dog appeared. He blinked in disbelief as the small figure appeared at the edge of the pit. Its fur was soaked, its tiny body shaking. But there it was, looking down at him with those bright, unwavering eyes, tail tucked between its legs but not turning away. Alex's heart twisted painfully. How did it find me? The dog barked once, a short, urgent sound, and Alex felt a strange pang of something. Grief? Regret? He didn't know. But before he could process it, the dog began running back toward the woods, its little paws slapping against the ground as it disappeared into the darkening trees. For a brief, agonizing moment, Alex wondered if it had just been his mind playing tricks on him, if the dog had only been a figment of his fear. But then he heard the soft patting of paws on the wet ground, and to his shock, the woman emerged from the trees, appearing as suddenly and mysteriously as she had before. She stood above the pit, looking down at him with calm, steady eyes. Her voice, though barely audible above the storm, called out to him. "Alex, hold on." The weight of her voice hit him like a punch to the gut. She knew his name. How did she know his name? Before he could even think, she reached down with a rope, tossing it toward him. Alex's hands, slick with water, reached up, grasping it as best as he could. His body shook from the cold and the fear, but he gripped it tightly, pulling himself toward her. The woman didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She simply pulled him from the pit, her hands strong, steady, and sure. She was calm, even in the midst of the storm. When Alex finally emerged from the pit, gasping for breath, he collapsed on the ground beside her, the rain continuing to fall in torrents around them. The dog stood by her side, watching him with those same, unwavering eyes. For the second time in a row, he had been saved by the woman and by the dog. "Why did you come back?" Alex asked, his voice hoarse, his throat tight. The woman didn't answer immediately. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm against the cold, wet fabric of his jacket. She didn't need to say anything. Her actions spoke louder than any words. "You're not alone," she finally said, her voice quiet but filled with certainty. "You're not alone, Alex. You don't have to be." And as Alex lay there, soaked to the bone, shivering in the rain, he finally understood what that meant. Chapter 7. The Return of a Friend. Hours passed in a blur. The storm didn't let up. The downpour soaked through to Alex's bones, his clothes heavy and clinging to him. He didn't know how long he had been lying there, half in the mud, half in shock. But at some point, the rain slowed to a drizzle, the oppressive weight of it finally easing up, though the sky remained dark, a lingering shroud over everything. Alex shivered as the woman gently helped him sit up. His mind was a jumble of thoughts, his body still trembling from the cold. He was trying to grasp what had just happened, how, just like that, someone had appeared like some kind of miracle pulling him from that pit. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice raw. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply pulled the hood of her raincoat over her head and sat down beside him, glancing over at the dog. The small creature was curled up at her feet, clearly exhausted, but still watchful. Its eyes flickered to Alex, as if checking to make sure he was okay. There was an odd, almost knowing look in its gaze. It wasn't just a dog, Alex thought. It was something more. "My name is Lila," she said at last, her voice quiet, but there was a strength in it that he couldn't ignore. She looked down at him, her eyes soft but unyielding. "I was passing through. Your dog helped me find you." Alex blinked in confusion. "My dog?" Lila nodded. "Yes, the one you nearly threw rocks at." Alex's throat tightened. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so small. The dog had come back for him again. It hadn't abandoned him. It had led this woman to save him, when no one else had ever come before. The thought made him feel strange inside, like something was shifting in him that he didn't want to acknowledge. A crack, A crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed, so carefully kept intact all these years. Alex paused, his voice faltering. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt it. I wasn't thinking. The words sounded foreign to him, clumsy even. He wasn't used to apologizing. He didn't know how. Lila tilted her head, considering him for a moment. I know you weren't thinking, but that doesn't excuse it, she said quietly. Pain is easy to cause, but it's a lot harder to undo. Alex lowered his gaze. He didn't have an answer for her, and he didn't know if he even could. Everything felt tangled in his chest, knotted up with things he didn't know how to feel. The anger, the hurt, the guilt. It was all there, simmering beneath the surface. And yet, for the first time, he felt something else. The flicker of hope, a glimmer of something softer. He didn't know what it was, but it was there, somewhere deep inside him. Lila remained silent beside him, as if giving him space to think. He wished he could shut out the thoughts swirling in his mind, but they refused to leave him alone. The sky was beginning to lighten, though the rain still clung to the trees and the ground. The air felt cooler now, a softness taking the place of the storm's rage. And then, without warning, the dog stood up and trotted over to Alex, nudging his hand with its cold, wet nose. Alex hesitated for only a second before he placed his hand on the dog's head, the feeling of the fur soft under his fingers. The dog looked up at him, tail wagging slowly, and Alex could swear it was smiling at him. Why? Alex whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Why didn't you just leave me? Lila looked over at him, her voice steady and calm. Because some things can't be abandoned. Not by those who still have hope. Hope. The word echoed in Alex's mind. What did it mean to have hope? To believe that things could change? He didn't know. Not yet. But for the first time, he didn't feel quite as sure that he couldn't change. Maybe he didn't have to stay stuck in the place he'd been, drowning in his anger and bitterness. Maybe there was more to life than the endless cycle of hate and hurt he had grown so used to. The dog sat beside him, its head tilted as if it was waiting for something, and Alex, without thinking, pulled it closer, cradling the dog's small, trembling body against him. It was warm despite the cold and the wet, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Alex felt a sense of peace he didn't know was possible. The dog's presence was simple, straightforward, but it made him feel less alone. Lila smiled faintly, watching them. You're not alone, she repeated. It's okay to let someone help you, even if it's just a dog. The words sank deep into Alex's chest, pressing against that fragile, newly cracked place inside him. He had spent so many years convincing himself that help wasn't coming, that no one would care, that no one would be there when he needed them. But here, in this moment, everything felt different. The dog was here, Lila was here, and even though it was still hard to understand, Alex felt a quiet shift inside him. He wasn't sure where it would take him, the strange feeling of connection, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so desperate to run away from it. Thanks, Alex said, looking at Lila for the first time with something close to sincerity in his eyes. For saving me, she nodded, her expression softening. It wasn't me who saved you, Alex. It was you. You let someone reach you. That's the first step. For the first time, Alex felt something in his chest open, slowly, cautiously, as if testing the waters. He didn't know what would come next, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the anger that had held him for so long. Maybe I can learn, Alex said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Lila gave him a small, understanding smile, and the dog, sensing something new between them, wiggled happily in Alex's arms. And in that moment, amidst the aftermath of the storm, Alex realized that it wasn't just about being pulled out of a pit, physically or metaphorically. It was about choosing to climb out, to reach for something more than what he'd always known. He wasn't alone anymore, and maybe that was the beginning of everything. Chapter 8: The Broken Slingshot. Days passed after the storm, and for the first time in a long while, Alex found himself thinking less about what had happened to him and more about what was to come. The sky had cleared, the air was fresh, and the world seemed quieter, as if it, too, had been given a moment to breathe again. The dog, whom he'd learned was named Max, had become a constant presence by his side, and the woman, Lila, visited him often. She always seemed to know when to appear, just as she had in the storm, offering a word of encouragement or simply sitting silently beside him as the hours passed. He could feel something shifting inside him, though he couldn't put it into words. The cracks in his hardened exterior, the ones that had begun to form when Lila and Max had shown him what it meant to not be alone, were starting to widen. The anger that had once consumed him, that constant, gnawing rage, felt distant. He wasn't sure it was gone completely, but it didn't have the same grip on him as it had before. It was as if a part of him had awakened, something he had buried long ago, and it felt strange, unfamiliar, but also necessary. He hadn't told Lila much about his life, about the constant fighting at home, the way his parents' voices echoed through the halls like the sound of a storm just waiting to break. But he had started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could change that. Maybe, for once, he could stop pretending that everything was fine. Maybe he didn't have to carry all that anger by himself. The moment that solidified his sense of change came unexpectedly, as all important moments seem to. It was a quiet afternoon. Alex had been walking with Max through the park near his home, the dog trotting happily at his side. The air was cool, the golden light of the afternoon sun filtering through the trees, casting long, slanted shadows across the path. As Alex watched Max chase after a fallen leaf, his gaze wandered down to the ground. His eyes landed on something he hadn't seen in days, the remnants of his old slingshot, the one he used to torment insects and animals with, the one he had kept close all these years. It had been discarded on the ground, half buried under a pile of dry leaves and twigs. The elastic was snapped, the wood splintered. For a moment, he didn't know why he felt the pang in his chest. It was just a slingshot, after all. But then it hit him. That slingshot had been his way of dealing with everything. It was his outlet for pain, his tool for expressing everything he couldn't say, couldn't face. It was the one thing he could control when everything else seemed out of his reach. And now, looking at it, broken and useless on the ground, he realized it was time to let it go. Max, sensing something was wrong, came over and nudged Alex's hand with his cold nose, looking up at him with those unblinking eyes. Alex reached down, absent-mindedly running his fingers through the dog's fur. The dog seemed to understand, as it always did, and simply sat by his side, waiting. Taking a deep breath, Alex reached down and picked up the slingshot. For a moment, he stared at it, turning it over in his hands. There was a sharp pang of regret, of something unresolved. The memories of the boy he used to be, of the anger and the cruelty, flooded his mind. It had been so easy to take out his frustration on the world, to lash out at anything and anyone who got in his way. The slingshot had been his weapon, his armor, his defense against the world he felt was always against him. But now, looking at it in his hands, he saw something else. A reminder of how far he had come. He wasn't that boy anymore. He didn't need it. He didn't need to hurt things just to feel in control. With a deep exhale, Alex raised the slingshot above his head and broke it in half, snapping the wood cleanly with a loud crack. The pieces fell to the ground, and Alex felt something inside him shift for good. It was gone now, the tool that had helped him hide behind his anger. In its place, there was something lighter, something brighter. Max barked, a joyful sound that filled the air with a strange sense of peace, and Alex, for the first time in his life, didn't feel the urge to lash out. The storm had passed. Not just in the sky, but inside of him. "I don't need this anymore, do I, buddy?" Alex whispered to the dog, crouching down to pet him. Max licked his hand affectionately, wagging his tail in response, as if to say, "No, you don't." For the first time, Alex didn't feel angry when he looked at the broken slingshot. He didn't feel regret or loss. He felt free. Free from something he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying all this time. That evening, when he returned home, his parents were in the middle of yet another argument. Alex could hear their raised voices from the hallway as he stood just outside the door, his hands still holding the remnants of the slingshot. It was strange. He had expected the anger to come back, to surge through him the way it always had. But it didn't. Instead, something calm filled him. It wasn't indifference, but a quiet resolve. A sense of knowing that this moment wasn't everything. That he didn't have to be defined by the chaos of his home anymore. He walked past the door without a second thought, not bothering to engage, and headed to his room. It was the first time in years that he hadn't felt the need to step into the middle of their argument, to try to fix what was broken in their relationship, to shout back in frustration. Instead, he let the door close behind him softly and sat down on the edge of his bed. Max jumped up beside him, curling into a ball at his feet. The dog was still there, still loyal and true, even after all the things Alex had done. It was a reminder that there was still good in the world, still hope, still something worth fighting for. He didn't need to be angry anymore. He didn't need to hurt things to feel alive. For the first time, Alex felt something inside him shift. Not just a broken slingshot, but a new sense of purpose. Maybe, just maybe, he could become the kind of person who could learn to love not just others but himself. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but at least now, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. And, as the darkness of night settled over the town, Alex's heart felt just a little bit lighter, just a little bit freer than it had before. Chapter 9. First Steps Toward Friendship. The days that followed felt like a strange kind of limbo, suspended between the old and the new, where everything was changing but nothing was certain. Alex found himself lost in thoughts he couldn't quite grasp, like fragments of a dream slipping through his fingers just as he thought he was beginning to understand them. He had broken the slingshot, and with it, the chains that had bound him for so long, but the world was still full of questions. Who was he now, without the anger, without the constant rush to defend himself? He had tried to avoid his parents as much as possible. Their arguments had become a constant background noise, a bitter, grating hum in the house. But it wasn't just that. It was the feeling that there was nothing left for him there. No warmth, no support. Just the cold silence that filled the spaces between the fights. The empty air that seemed to press in on him from all sides. But when he was with Max, it was different. The dog's presence was simple, uncomplicated. Max didn't ask anything of him, didn't demand explanations or apologies. He just was a warm, loyal presence in the midst of all the chaos. And in the dog's quiet companionship, Alex found something he hadn't realized he needed so desperately: peace. One afternoon, after a long walk with Max through the now-budding park, Alex found himself standing in front of the rundown playground near his house, staring at the swing set that had always been a part of his childhood. He hadn't played there in years, not since his father's temper had driven him to avoid anything that might remind him of simpler, happier days. The swings had rusted over the years, the chains worn and creaking in the wind, but they still moved, still swayed gently, just as they had when he was younger. He didn't know why he had come here. Maybe it was the urge to reconnect with something that wasn't broken, to find a piece of himself that had been left behind. Or maybe it was just the quiet tug of nostalgia, something he didn't want to admit, even to himself. Max sat by his feet, watching him with those patient, knowing eyes. "Come on, boy," Alex said softly, his voice rough from the weight of the thoughts in his head. "Let's go home." But before he could turn away, something stopped him. Something soft and persistent in the distance. A small figure appeared, walking through the park's overgrown path. Alex blinked, realizing it was a kid from school. A boy who he didn't know well, but who always seemed to be watching him. His name was Ben. A kid who kept mostly to himself, never saying much but always lingering on the edges, as if waiting for an invitation that never came. And for a moment, Alex found himself wondering why Ben was looking his way. He knew what it felt like to be on the outside, to want to be seen but never really be noticed. Ben's eyes met his, and the briefest flicker of recognition passed between them. Something Alex couldn't quite place, but it felt different. The boy hesitated for a moment, then, as if making a decision, started walking over. "Hey," Ben said, his voice shy but steady. He stopped a few paces away from Alex and Max, a nervous smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I saw you with the dog. You..." You always walk him this way. Alex was caught off guard by the question. Normally, he'd brush someone off, make an excuse, avoid making any real connection. But something in the boy's voice made him pause. He thought about the days he'd spent with Max, the simple joy the dog brought him, and found himself nodding before he could stop himself. Yeah, Alex said quietly. Most days. Max looked up at Ben and, without hesitation, trotted over to him, wagging his tail. Ben's eyes widened for a moment before he knelt down, offering a tentative hand to the dog. Max sniffed it, then nuzzled into Ben's palm, as if to confirm what Alex already knew. That Max didn't judge, didn't question, didn't care about who you were or what you'd done. I'm Ben, the boy said after a moment, his voice still unsure but more confident now that the dog was accepting him. I like dogs. Alex, he replied, and there was an awkward pause before he added, You're from school, right? Ben nodded, his expression softening. Yeah, I've seen you around. Alex wasn't sure how to keep the conversation going. He had never been good at making small talk, never really wanted to. But there was something about Ben, something familiar, something that made Alex want to try. So, after a moment of silence, he spoke again, his voice low but steady. You're always alone, he said, the words tumbling out before he could think to stop them. I don't think I've ever seen you with anyone. Ben looked down at his feet, his face flushing a little. Yeah, he murmured, kicking at the dirt with the toe of his sneaker. I don't really fit in. Don't know why, it's just always been that way. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alex found himself nodding in understanding. He wasn't sure why, but he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't alone in this. Ben, just like him, had his own battles, his own quiet struggles. I get it, Alex said softly, his gaze falling on Max, who was now sitting calmly beside Ben. The dog's presence seemed to bridge the gap between them, a silent witness to this new, fragile connection. I think I know what you mean. Ben glanced up, his eyes wide with surprise. Really? Yeah, Alex replied, his voice gaining strength. I guess we all feel like that sometimes. Like nobody really sees us. Ben looked at him for a long moment, and then, just as Alex was about to speak again, Ben grinned. Slowly, shyly, but genuine. Well, Ben said, standing up straight, if you don't mind me hanging around, maybe we could walk sometime? Alex didn't know why, but the offer felt real, like maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something new. He glanced at Max, who was now happily trotting around them in circles, then back at Ben. I think I'd like that, Alex said, his voice lighter than it had been in a long time. And for the first time, as they began walking together with Max leading the way, Alex didn't feel like the outsider, the misfit, the boy who was too angry to fit in. He felt like he was finally starting to be seen, like he was finally beginning to walk a path that wasn't so lonely anymore. Max, of course, trotted happily beside them, as if he knew all along that this was exactly where they were meant to be. And in that moment, Alex realized something important. Sometimes, the first step toward friendship isn't about reaching out, but about letting yourself be seen. Letting someone else reach out to you. Chapter 10. The Light Within. The days seemed to stretch out in a new rhythm, a rhythm Alex had never experienced before. He and Ben, along with Max, spent more and more time together, walking through the park, talking, laughing, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about everything. Alex found himself slowly letting down the walls he had built around himself for so long. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard, and every now and then, a flicker of the anger he had once known would flare up in his chest, but it wasn't as fierce as it had been before. Ben, in his quiet way, had a way of helping Alex see things differently. Ben didn't push him to open up. He just listened. And in the silence between their words, Alex began to understand something that had always eluded him. That it wasn't always about the things you said, but about the things you didn't need to say at all. Ben never asked about his past, never pushed him to explain what had made him so angry, so shut off from the world. And that, in itself, was a kind of healing. There were days when Alex felt the weight of the old life pressing on him. The noise of his parents' constant arguments would fill the house like a storm, And even though he had begun to look at things differently, he couldn't always escape it. But there was something about his walks with Max and Ben that grounded him. Something about being outside, with the wind on his face and the dog running free at their heels, that made everything else seem quieter, smaller, more manageable. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky and the leaves on the trees turned golden and amber, Alex found himself sitting on a bench by the lake, staring at the reflection of the trees in the still water. Ben was sitting next to him, his eyes on the water as well, but his mind clearly somewhere else. Max was sprawled out on the grass at their feet, lazily watching the two of them, his tail twitching every now and then. "You ever think about how different things could be?" Alex asked suddenly, his voice quieter than usual. Ben turned to look at him, his brow furrowed slightly. "Different how?" "I don't know," Alex replied, shrugging. I feel like I've been stuck in one place for so long. Like there's this whole world out there, and I haven't been able to see it." Ben didn't say anything at first. He just looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, but not unkind. Then, after a moment, he spoke. "I get it," he said softly. "Sometimes it feels like everything is just stuck, like you can't move forward. But you can. You are moving forward. Maybe not as fast as you want, but that's okay. You're already different, Alex. You just don't see it yet." Alex looked down at his hands, the words sinking in slowly. It was true. He had started to change, but it wasn't something that happened all at once. It was more like a slow burn, a soft glow that was beginning to light up the corners of his life. But it was still hard to see sometimes. Still hard to believe that the anger, the fear, the loneliness could really be behind him. "I guess," Alex said slowly, feeling a bit unsure. "It's just hard to let go of everything. The way I used to be. The way I used to think about things." Ben's gaze softened, and he leaned back on the bench, looking up at the sky as if searching for the right words. "Yeah," Ben said. "I know what you mean. It's like, when you've been one way for so long, you don't always know how to be anything else. But the thing is, you are changing. Maybe you can't see it all the time, but it's there." "I see it." Alex felt something stir inside him, something deep and warm, like a spark that had been kindled and was slowly beginning to spread. Maybe Ben was right. Maybe, just maybe, he was changing, even if it didn't always feel that way. Max stood up suddenly, wagging his tail and bounding toward the water's edge, causing both of them to laugh as they watched him chase after a butterfly that had landed nearby. The moment felt light, carefree, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Alex felt the weight of his past begin to loosen, just a little. As the evening wore on and the sky turned pink and purple, Alex and Ben found themselves walking along the path toward their homes, side by side, without needing to say much. Max trotted happily between them, as always, and for the first time, Alex realized that the world felt a little different. Maybe not perfect, but a little less heavy, a little more open. When they reached the end of the path, where their houses sat just a few steps away from each other, Ben turned to Alex with a smile. "Hey," Ben said, "you ever want to hang out more? Just, not talk about anything, just be outside or something?" Alex paused, thinking for a moment. It had been a long time since he had felt like he could just be. No expectations, no pressure, just time spent with someone who understood that sometimes silence was just as important as words. "Yeah," Alex said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'd like that." As Ben waved goodbye and walked down his driveway, Alex stood there for a moment, watching him go. He felt something inside him, something soft, something new, take root. It wasn't the same as it had been before. It wasn't the fierce, overwhelming rush of anger that he had once felt. It was different. It was quiet, peaceful. Max nudged his hand, as if reminding him that he wasn't alone, and Alex crouched down to scratch behind the dog's ears. For the first time in a long time, he felt a warmth spread through him that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval, anyone else's expectations. It was his own peace, his own beginning. Sometimes, when you've spent so long in the dark, it takes a little time for the light to seep in. But little by little, the cracks in the walls you've built start to show. And when that light finally starts to shine through, you realize that maybe, just maybe, the world you've been waiting for was right there all along. You just had to take the first step toward it. And in that moment, with Max at his side, Alex realized that he wasn't just beginning to change. He was already beginning to love the person he was becoming. He wasn't who he had been, and he didn't have to be. The journey was far from over, but Alex knew one thing for certain. The hardest part was behind him. The rest? Well, the rest was waiting.